Airlines assure passengers that flying on an airplane is one of the safest ways to travel. However, accidents still happen, and in a person's mind, a plane crash might be one of the most horrifying incidents that can occur in life. After several horrific aviation disasters in modern history, many of them remain a complete mystery. Sometimes, after studying thousands of tiny fragments, it's revealed that unforeseen human errors, bad weather, and mysterious mechanical failures were the culprits behind a flight's demise. But what can be said when an entire plane with passengers and crew disappears without a trace? Like the case of the Canadian company, Pacific Airlines, where a flight simply vanished into thin air. You're watching the Top Facts channel, and now we'll show you 15 mysterious stories about vanished flights. Get ready, it's not for the faint-hearted. But for some reason, it's impossible to stop and not watch the entire compilation. We wish you an interesting viewing experience, so let's go. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Perhaps no enigma has plagued the minds of the broadest audience as much as the mysterious disappearance of the infamous Malaysian Airlines Boeing. This story is still fresh and haunting, an absurd and eerie event that seems out of place in the 21st century civilization, where one would think every corner of the planet could be traced and located. Flight MH370 took off from the Malaysian capital, Kuala Lumpur, to Beijing on March 8, 2014. However, what happened to the 227 passengers and 14 crew members remains one of the most tragic and inexplicable disappearances to this day. The aircraft was about to enter Vietnamese airspace when suddenly the transponder was turned off and the flight turned back from its designated course, eventually vanishing from radars. For weeks after the tragedy, the entire world was consumed by the search for answers. Though it was an unwanted but glaring assumption, many believed the plane had crashed in a remote area of the Indian Ocean south of Australia. Other theories ranged from mechanical malfunctions to hijacking and even the pilot's suicide. However, this last version was rejected since it's known that the plane's communication signals were manually disabled from within the aircraft, no matter how chilling it may seem. The flight path was also manually altered before the disappearance. Despite extensive searches, only some burnt fragments were discovered and washed ashore. The fuselage and the black box are yet to be found. Flight 522 Helios. The incident involving the notorious Flight 522 of the Cypriot company Helios remains one of the most shocking and distressing aviation disasters of the 21st century. To this day, it is impossible to explain how such a tragedy occurred on a flight that by all parameters should have been flawless. The Boeing 737 was en route from Larnaca to Prague, but ended up crashing in the mountains near the settlement of Grammatiko in Greece. Just 5 minutes into the flight, a certain warning signal sounded in the cockpit. But unfortunately, the sound was identical to the takeoff configuration signal and was ignored by the crew, who continued to ascend. Once the aircraft reached an altitude of 5,500 meters, oxygen masks deployed in the cabin, and the last attempts to communicate with the pilots were futile due to the onset of hypoxia. At an altitude of 10,000 meters, they were severely lacking oxygen. The plane was on autopilot, and everyone on board, including the crew, fell into a deep unconsciousness. This silent flight resembled a ghostly phenomenon. All instruments were operational, lights were on in the cabin, but there was no movement. People fell asleep within seconds as if under a spell. 2 Greek F-16 fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the flight. Upon approaching, they discovered that the captain's seat was empty, and the co-pilot had slumped over the controls. However, they noticed a steward entering the cockpit who had managed to use an oxygen cylinder, but the flight was already doomed. The fuel had run out, and the plane was steadily losing altitude, gliding in the sky. The only heroic action the steward could take was to steer the plane away from populated areas. Gliding without fuel inevitably led to the crash. The aircraft hit the mountains, briefly bounced a few meters before impact, and ultimately crashed into the mountainside, breaking into small pieces. None of the 121 passengers and crew members survived. This dreadful crash led the airline to bankruptcy and remains one of the worst tragedies in history. Flight 311 Thai Airways. This flight has become a lesson for pilots worldwide, illustrating the worst-case scenario of what can go wrong during flight in mountainous areas, labeled with the overall notion of "it can't get worse." On July 31, 1992, Thai Airways Flight 311, an Airbus A310, took off from Bangkok to Kathmandu. The Kathmandu airport in Nepal is surrounded by high mountains to the north, allowing approaches only from the south. Here comes a critical detail that played a significant role in the unfolding of the situation, resulting in a devastating plane crash that claimed the lives of all 113 people on board. All of them disappeared over the Himalayas, and a few days later, the wreckage was found miles off course. The Nepalese airport lacked a radar system at the time, and the dispatcher on duty had only 2 months of experience. Initially, the aircraft's flaps did not retract, and the captain requested a go-around. A series of communication misunderstandings between the crew and the dispatcher led the plane in the wrong direction. Unexpectedly, the ground proximity warning system activated, but the signal was not taken seriously. The crew simply didn't believe the system. By the time the gravity of the situation became clear, it was too late. The plane collided with a mountain peak at an altitude of 3,500 meters and disintegrated completely. Nothing remained except a black spot on the rock face and scattered debris far below. Flight JL50. A rescue operation to search for a crashed plane has begun in West Bengal. However, instead of the desired wreckage, the remains of another flight that disappeared without a trace 35 years ago were discovered. This resolved one of the aviation world's oldest mysteries that had puzzled the entire world for decades. The plane that vanished without a trace, Flight JL50, was found with a horrifying cargo. Inside it were the remains of 92 passengers' skeletons, and incredibly, 2 bodies were still in a coma. This shocking evidence indicates that the flight perished as a result of being hijacked by inexperienced hijackers. They were unable to control the plane, which led to its crash and the death of all passengers. Stardust CS59. For over 70 years, the Stardust incident has been considered one of the strangest events in the aviation world. Stardust was a transport plane belonging to British South American Airways, BSAA, which translates to Stardust. It disintegrated in space, leaving no hope of learning its fate. Passenger flight CS59 of the South American Airlines, traveling from Buenos Aires to Santiago, carried an intriguing set of passengers, like characters from a movie. An ideal cast for a murder mystery. 2 traveling friends, businessmen, a Swiss and an Englishman, a Palestinian allegedly carrying diamonds sewn into his clothes, another businessman, and a Chilean citizen returning home from Germany. Additionally, an English diplomat with a hefty portfolio of documents for the British Embassy was on board. This group of passengers boarded on August 2, 1947, and despite their route through a dangerous mountain pass, the high caliber of the pilot promised a comfortable flight with breathtaking views from the window. The plane was meant to fly much higher than the mountain peaks. However, a mysterious message received from the plane shortly before the expected arrival looked strange. A combination of letters in a single line read as Stendek. The enigmatic Morse code message was sent 3 times, but then radio silence followed, and the plane never reached its destination. The only version of the deciphered message suggests a mistake by the radio operator who received it. They might have misread the letter combination. The message should have read STR DEC, starting descent. The difference between the Morse code for R and EN is minimal. A comprehensive search operation involved the Chilean and Argentine armies, scouring the entire imaginable area by foot and from the air, but they found not a trace of the Stardust flight. The mysterious coded message kept researchers intrigued, with some even suggesting that the plane was abducted by an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Only in 1998 did Argentine mountaineers discover a horrifying find: the remains of the plane's engine on a mountain 80 kilometers from Santiago. In 2000, an expedition found other crash debris, parts of the propeller and landing gear, as well as human remains, which were identified using DNA analysis in 2002. However, what caused the plane to crash onto the mountainside remains a mystery that we were never destined to uncover. Let's continue. And next up is Pacific Airlines Flight 3505. Let's go back to the early days of civil aviation, where failures occurred much more frequently than they do now. But cases of planes disappearing without a trace were extraordinary, and that's exactly what happened to a Pacific Airlines plane. In 1951, Canadian company Pacific Airlines Flight 3505 left Vancouver with 37 people on board, including the crew, heading to Tokyo. They were scheduled to make their first stop in Alaska after 45 minutes. Unfortunately, the plane never arrived there. Authorities were immediately notified, and a large-scale search and rescue operation was launched. According to general consensus, they had crashed somewhere on an icy surface, but after 3 months of searching, not a single clue to the mystery was found. Most of the passengers on this flight were military personnel from the US and Canada, and news of the loss quickly spread worldwide. Strangely, there were no distress signals or other indications from the plane. It was as if the plane had simply vanished from the face of the earth, and subsequently, neither its wreckage nor the passengers' bodies were discovered. It just disappeared. Do you have any theories about where the plane could have disappeared to from the sky? B47. We've already understood that it's possible for an entire plane to disappear and no one can find any wreckage. But when it's carrying something special, the mystery gets even more complex. In 1956, the Boeing B47 Stratojet, an American jet bomber developed by Boeing in the mid-1940s, took off from a military base in Florida and was supposed to land at an airbase in Morocco with 2 aerial refuelings. The first refueling went smoothly, but during the second over the Mediterranean Sea, the tanker couldn't locate the B-47. Could it have descended for refueling and ended up in a cloud? But no. The plane disappeared in the sky, and subsequent thorough searches, spanning many miles around, yielded nothing but bewilderment. No wreckage, no signs of the crew, no witnesses, no hints, and no evidence of the catastrophe. So why do the questions about what happened to the bomber persist? Because its cargo was very interesting to many nations. It carried 2 capsules of material for making a nuclear bomb. The material itself couldn't detonate, but this component was crucial for weapon production. Maybe it got intercepted somewhere. Agree, such a cargo is the last thing a government and an airline would want to lose just like that. Perhaps the solution to the disappearance of the dangerous plane is known to someone, but certainly not to us. Flight 712, Aer Lingus. After 55 years since the crash of Aer Lingus Flight 712, investigators haven't come closer to understanding why this plane went down in the sea near the island of Tuskar Rock in the United Kingdom. Flight 712 was a routine route, a short journey from Cork to Heathrow across the Irish Sea, completed countless times. But the passengers who boarded it would never rise again. Irish winters were much harsher then, and during this time of year, swans would begin mass migration to warmer regions. This version remains dominant. A collision with birds could have caused a dramatic crash of the flight, and while investigations confirmed this possibility, it's unlikely that the crash was solely due to this. Another detail is that the plane flew through an active missile range, and many believe it could have been mistaken for a spying drone. The British military ship Penelope conducted exercises in the area, but the military vehemently denied any involvement. Strangely, no one could explain why all records for that date mysteriously disappeared from the ship's log. On the day of the flight, the weather was perfect, and no one expected any trouble. But in the last communication from the cockpit, the second pilot reported a sudden descent to 3,500 meters. Another plane in the area was asked to descend and search for Flight 712, but without success. The flight vanished from sight. Its wreckage was found about 10 kilometers from the island, but answers were never found. In contrast to other airlines that retire flight numbers of crashed flights, Aer Lingus still operates Flight 712. Flight 967 Varig. Unfortunately, falling from the sky is not uncommon for airplanes, but it's rare for a large cargo Boeing 707 to completely vanish from the face of the Earth. Not even a small fragment is left behind for solving the mystery. The enigmatic disappearance of Varig Flight 967 on its way from Tokyo to Los Angeles hasn't faded into oblivion. The point, about 500 kilometers off the coast of Japan, was the last known location of the plane before communication was lost. It's evident that the flight suffered a crash, but some very strange coincidences make its disappearance suspicious. The aircraft was piloted by 55-year-old Brazilian captain Gilberto Arocho da Silva, one of the most experienced pilots who had already survived a Boeing emergency landing. Another oddity is that the flight was transporting a collection of 50 paintings by Manabu Mabe, a Brazilian artist of Japanese origin, and the value of the cargo exceeded $1 million. Quite the valuable passenger, isn't it? No distress signals or messages were received during the flight. No unusual activity was observed, and subsequently no wreckage or crew traces were found. Literally, this plane vanished. Could it be interpreted as an elaborate art theft? Other theories were also considered. For instance, perhaps the flight accidentally entered Soviet airspace and was shot down. Unlikely, since no messages or calls were made from the plane. In the event of a sudden decompression where everyone aboard lost consciousness, the plane might have crashed into the Pacific Ocean, but the entire area was meticulously and unsuccessfully searched. Not a scrap, not a piece of debris. Only mysteries remain from Flight 967. In 1974, the world was shaken by what remains to this day the only unsolved case of an airplane hijacking. And the decades-old mystery stands as a sadly notorious white spot in aviation history. D.B. Cooper, this name might become possibly a term denoting the greatest suave robber. Someone boarded a plane in a business suit with a neat black tie, ordered whiskey with soda, and took off from Portland. But before landing in Seattle, here's what happened. The entire crew was taken hostage, and the hijacker demanded a ransom of $200,000. His demands were met upon landing, and frightened passengers were released. The crew was forced to remain on the plane with their sole, ominous passenger. He made the crew take off for Mexico, but without retracting the landing gear, in order to stay at an altitude of 3,000 meters and prevent the possibility of deceiving himself with a landing elsewhere. And also, to leave the plane. Evidently, he parachuted out along with his money over the forests of the Pacific Northwest and disappeared. Only a few bills with numbers confirming their connection to the crime were found, but no traces of Cooper. He vanished. Recently, a woman claiming to be his niece emerged, but she didn't reveal how Cooper managed to pull off one of the greatest heists of all time. Likely, this story was a true catastrophe for flight security systems and inspired other criminals with similar ideas in the future. incredible and rare luck. Surviving an airplane crash, but after stewardess Vesna Vulovic found herself in one of the most insane episodes of passenger aviation. She literally flew into history, being automatically registered in the Guinness Book of World Records as the person who survived the highest fall without a parachute. In January 1972, a Yugoslav Airlines Douglas DC-9 was flying over the mountains of Czechoslovakia at an altitude of 10,000 meters when an explosion occurred on board, causing the aircraft to start disintegrating in midair. Vesna ended up trapped in the tail of the plane. Her path was blocked by a food cart, and while others were being sucked out of the plane, she remained alone in the tail section, continuing to fall. The tail landed on the snowy forest on the slope of a mountain, appearing as a soft blanket. It was enough for the stewardess to survive. It is assumed that a bomb was planted on the plane during a stopover in Copenhagen, but who did it and how it was done remains unknown. Vesna spent 10 days in a coma, and despite a long list of injuries such as a fractured skull, 2 crushed vertebrae, broken pelvic and leg bones, she fully recovered. She even joked that she had 9 lives like a cat. Vesna returned to work for the airline, but this time she was assigned a ground position. Unfortunately, she was the only survivor of the crash, and even today this case remains the most incredible miracle. Many people fantasized in their childhood about sneaking onto a ship and traveling somewhere secretly without a ticket. But for someone, this story became a real-life episode. A 15-year-old boy decided to become a secret stowaway passenger. He hadn't seen his mom in a long time and decided to visit her in his native Africa. Running away from home in California, he climbed over a fence at the airport, bypassed all tracking and security systems, found an airplane, and got into the wheel well. If only he had known that the flight was not heading to Africa, but to Hawaii. But for him, it was more of a plus than a minus. The temperature outside was extremely freezing, and how he survived the 5-hour flight at a poorly oxygenated altitude without an oxygen tank and warm clothing is truly a miracle. Medical workers confirmed that the boy had an unprecedented stroke of luck. Surviving under such conditions is almost impossible. The amazed airport staff noticed the boy emerging from the aircraft's wheel well, which had just landed. Imagine how surprised all the authorities were. Well, if he wasn't crushed by the giant landing gear during takeoff and landing, that was only half the battle. There's hardly any space to lie comfortably for 5 hours in that compartment. And the climate is like you've just climbed Mount Everest, freezing cold and nothing to breathe. The boy admitted that he lost consciousness several times during the flight. But how, you might ask, can you survive when the sounds of a roaring jet engine are right in your head? Doctors say that his youth most likely saved him, but such a dangerous stunt could have caused irreversible brain damage. Apparently, this boy was born under a lucky star in Africa. Kenyan Airlines Flight 507. In flight, we rely on the crew and captain, who are supposed to prioritize the safety of everyone on board. Usually, that's the case. But unfortunately for the passengers of Kenyan Airlines Flight 507, their reality was far from ideal. A chain of fatal pilot errors, which no one could explain, led to one of the worst airline disasters the world has seen. The first flight from Côte d'Ivoire went smoothly. At the airport in Cameroon, 3 planes were waiting for departure to Douala, but stormy conditions caused a delay affecting all flights in the area. Except for the captain of Flight 507, 52-year-old Francis Mabario, who decided to take off without any permission or approval to act on his own discretion. After taking off to an altitude of 300 meters without visual references, everything went wrong. First, the autopilot didn't engage, but none of the pilots noticed it. Only when the plane started tilting heavily to the right did the struggle to correct the mistake begin. It's as if they didn't realize it was civilian aviation, not military. In the end, the plane entered a spin and after spiraling down, crashed into a mangrove swamp, burying the unfortunate passengers in wet mud. None of the 108 people on board survived to tell the story of this tragic flight. The accident report attributed the crash to fatal errors made by the deceased pilot in stormy conditions and severe spatial disorientation. It's unclear what compelled him to fly towards his death. This catastrophe could have been easily prevented by a simple method: waiting. Egypt Airlines 990. When it comes to unexplained aviation disasters, Egypt Airlines Flight 990 is the most contentious incident in modern history. While there is no evidence of the crash's cause, there are plenty of questionable details that raise suspicion about the pilot's sanity. Did he intend to seek revenge in such a horrific manner? Egypt Airlines Flight 990 departed from Los Angeles and made a stop in New York. That was the last time anyone on the ground could hear or see the passengers and crew. Approximately 30 minutes after takeoff, Flight 990 reached a cruising altitude of 10,000 meters, and without any warning, in case of distress, the signal is Mayday. It simply started descending to 5,000 meters. During the steep descent, the Boeing 767 reached the speed of sound. It was a deadly plummet. Although it managed to stabilize at some point, the plane soon disappeared from radar and crashed into the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean. Some believe it fell victim to the mysterious pull of the Bermuda Triangle. Countless ships have met their end in the depths of this abyss. Egyptian authorities blocked the FBI's involvement in the investigation, but when they claimed that the crash, which killed 217 people on board, was due to mechanical failure, the whole world felt deceived. One fact is known: the first officer of this crew had recently been demoted, and on this flight, the very supervisor who initiated the captain's demotion was on board. Insider sources claim that the crash was executed as a dirty revenge plan. How about the last words of the first officer broadcasted? "I'm finished. I rely on God." AirAsia 8501. People might get nervous before long flights, fearing incidents, but even on short flights, any mishap can occur. This was proven by the aviation disaster of AirAsia Flight 8501. Taking off from Indonesia and heading to Singapore just 2 hours later, it plummeted into the bottom of the ocean. An immediate search and rescue operation began, but hope of finding survivors quickly faded. The plane carried 162 passengers and flew for about 40 minutes before it disappeared from radar, crashing into the Java Sea. No distress signals were sent, and the plane vanished without a trace. The prolonged search mission eventually discovered only 116 bodies, while the rest, along with wreckage, rest at the ocean floor. Experts believe a critical control system malfunction prompted the captain to attempt a reset of the onboard computer, and everything went awry. Ineffective communication, or rather misunderstanding between the pilots, also contributed to the disaster. In conclusion, AirAsia Flight 8501 encountered the heart of a perfect storm due to a series of unfortunate events. Even with no distress messages, the black box data revealed that the pilots were struggling with control until the moment of impact with the water. After this story, you may not want to fly anywhere anytime soon, but we will show it to you, although we have nothing to add to the unanswered questions. To this day, it is one of the most memorable air disasters in the world that ever happened to the huge Airbus A330. We always welcome new giant models of liners with great enthusiasm, assuming that they are much safer and luckier than their predecessors. But our optimism dies in the very first crash. The most modern aircraft at that time became available, and it looked so perfect that the thought of a crash seemed absurd. Until it happened with Flight 447 of Air France. For over 2 years, Researchers struggled to find the causes of the catastrophe, but the wreckage and flight recorders lie beneath a 3-kilometer thick layer of the Atlantic Ocean. Specialists puzzled over a series of mysterious messages received from the plane's onboard systems. For example, data showed that the speed sensors were frozen. Flight 447 Air France could not have fallen victim solely to harsh weather. Most likely, it created a fatal chain of errors that claimed the lives of all 228 people on board. The crew reacted incorrectly to the signals of the aircraft malfunction, and further incorrect steps led to the passenger flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris falling from the sky over the Atlantic Ocean. This crash became the deadliest for Air France, and the largest catastrophe involving an Airbus A330. Even a series of small mistakes can lead to the demise of a modern liner, and even the newest technology still has to rely on the mercy of the heavens. You've seen a series of the most mysterious and tragic air disasters of all time. Perhaps all these secrets can make us buy a train ticket next time. Thank you very much for watching until the very end. If you liked the episode and want to see something similar, then write comments like subscribe to the Top Facts channel, and right now watch all our previous top episodes.